Today, we're diving into a really hot debate in the conservation world: wind turbines versus the pesticide DDT. One is a very modern, very visible threat. The other, it's like an invisible ghost from our chemical past. So, we're going to look at the data and see how they actually compare.
First things first, we have to get our heads around the scale of the problem we're even talking about, because it is absolutely staggering. Since 1970, North America has lost almost 3 billion birds. That's a 29% drop. And we're not just talking about a few rare species here. This is a massive crisis that's hitting birds across the board.
So inside this huge decline, you always hear two culprits being pointed at: the chemical legacy of DDT and the very physical reality of wind turbines. But here's the question: are they even in the same league? To figure that out, we have to look beyond just counting the bodies and really understand how they actually harm birds.
And that gets us to our first major point. You see, these two threats couldn't be more different in how they operate. One worked from the inside out, silently, while the other is a very loud, very external, physical obstacle.
Think of it this way. DDT was a reproductive silencer. It was basically a biological weapon that just shut down the ability of entire species to have babies. Wind turbines, on the other hand, are a mechanical hazard, a direct physical collision that kills individual birds. And that is the absolute core difference: a systemic biological crisis versus a localized physical risk.
So the secret weapon that made DDT so unbelievably devastating was a process called biomagnification. You see, DDT is fat-soluble. That means it doesn't just pass through an animal's body. Nope, it gets stored in the fat, it builds up, and it gets more and more concentrated as you go up the food chain.
And here's how that whole path of poison actually played out. It would start with tiny organisms, insects, worms. Then they'd get eaten by bigger things, like songbirds and fish. And when the apex predators, we're talking bald eagles, peregrine falcons, ate them, the poison hit the jackpot. Its concentration would be magnified thousands, even millions of times. The result? Eggshells so thin, they would literally crush under the weight of their own mother.
Okay, so let's talk numbers. Because to really get a handle on the impact of wind turbines, you have to put the numbers in perspective.
The median, kind of middle-of-the-road estimate for how many birds are killed by land-based wind turbines in the U.S. each year is about 234,000. Now, that is not a small number, and sure, some estimates push it way higher, up to over 1 million. But the real question is, how does that stack up against everything else?
And this is where the perspective just completely flips. When you put turbine deaths next to other things we do, the scale is just, well, it's not even close. Collisions with buildings are estimated to kill around 599 million birds a year. And free-ranging domestic cats? Get ready for this. A jaw-dropping 2.4 billion.
So what does this all mean? It means that based on these estimates, wind turbines are responsible for something like 1 out of every 5,000 to 10,000 human-caused collision deaths. It's a tiny, tiny slice of a much bigger pie.
And this brings us right back to that fundamental difference we talked about earlier. With DDT, we weren't just counting individual dead birds from poisoning. We were watching the next generation completely vanish. It was a threat aimed not at a single bird, but at the very future of an entire species.
I mean, just look at these numbers. In 1963, there were only 417 breeding pairs of bald eagles left in the lower 48 states. Peregrine falcons were essentially wiped out east of the Mississippi. Brown pelican colonies were just failing completely. This wasn't a dip, this was an existential crisis. And the fact that they all came roaring back after the DDT ban, well, that's pretty much the smoking gun.
Now, it's really important to remember that this wasn't always a settled science. There was a huge, fierce debate around banning DDT. So let's take a neutral look back at the kind of evidence both sides were using at the time.
On one side, you had landmark studies like this one from 1965. Scientists documented a really clear die-off. In the town that sprayed DDT, they found 15 times more dead birds than in the town next door that didn't. This was pretty powerful evidence of immediate, lethal poisoning.
But, on the other side, critics of a ban pointed to data that seemed to tell a totally different story. A biologist named J. Gordon Edwards, for example, noted that hawk migration counts at a famous spot actually went up during the peak DDT years. He argued this just didn't fit with the narrative of a widespread decline.
DDT defenders also love to use the Audubon Christmas bird count data, and you can see why. It showed the number of robins seen per person went up 12 times between 1941 and 1960. Even eagles saw a little bump. The thing is, the scientific consensus now is that this wasn't a real boom in birds. It was a boom in bird watchers. More people were out looking, so they saw more birds.
So even though these two threats work in totally different ways, there is one crucial place where their paths cross. They both have a disproportionate impact on birds of prey.
Yeah, both DDT and wind turbines are especially dangerous for these large, slow-breeding raptors. We're talking about eagles, hawks, falcons, species that just can't bounce back quickly from population losses because they take a long time to mature and don't have many chicks. But, and this is a key point, they're vulnerable for two completely different reasons. For DDT, it was all about being at the top of the food chain. That's where the poison concentrated. For wind turbines, it's their behavior. It's the very way they soar and use the wind to hunt that puts them, tragically, right in the path of the spinning blades. So after all of this, what's the big takeaway? Well, when you're comparing these two threats, it really becomes clear that context is absolutely everything.
Honestly, the comeback story of the bald eagle might be the most powerful evidence there is. Their population was absolutely crushed by DDT. But after the ban, it started to recover. And what is so incredible is that their population has continued to skyrocket into the hundreds of thousands during the exact same time that the wind industry has been growing like crazy.
In the end, the comparison just shows a difference not just in scale, but in kind. DDT was a nationwide biological crisis that was attacking the very ability of species to even exist. Wind turbines are a manageable mechanical hazard, a problem that can be worked on through better siting, better technology, and smarter regulation.
And that brings us to the biggest picture of all. This whole debate between DDT and turbines can sometimes distract us from the single greatest threat that birds face today, and that is habitat loss. That collapse of grassland birds, that's over 720 million of the birds we've lost, right there. It's driven by agriculture and modern pesticides that destroy their food source. Direct mortality is part of the puzzle for sure, but the loss of habitat is the foundation of the whole crisis.
Which leaves us with one last thought. The fight to ban DDT proved that we are capable of seeing a catastrophic environmental threat and actually reversing it. So the question for us now is, can we take that same focus, that same will, and apply it to the slower, more complicated, but even bigger crisis of habitat loss that's facing birds in the 21st century?